Well, that was pretty funny. Pretty pie in the sky, too, if you ask me. Not much chance that the Holy Roman Church, aged 1,700 years more or less, and steeped in European, even Italian culture to its core, is going to suddenly remake itself in the model of an American feminist, cultural, creative, social justice advocate, is there? No. So if there's any chance at all for an outsider to become pope, that candidate is going to have to be a little more realistic. And I'm nothing if not realistic. And I actually do care about the health of the Catholic Church, among other religious institutions, so I decided to run for the job myself. Christine for Pope. Right? Now, before I start my campaign speech, I have to say that I'm well aware that the election of a new pope is serious business. And I don't mean this sermon to be in any way disrespectful to our brothers and sisters in faith who are Catholic, or even the institution of Catholicism. I offer the sermon rather as a lighthearted way to learn a little bit about religions in general, and Catholics in particular, and to reflect on our own issues as Unitarian Universalists. So, with that disclaimer, here we go. Now, I do know that there is an insurmountable obstacle in the way of my rump run for Pope. There's no getting around it. There are many people who would consider me completely unsuitable because I'm a Unitarian Universalist and an unbaptized one at that. That would be a lot to overlook, I realize, but the fact of the matter is that the Catholic Church is a very troubled institution, and very troubled institutions usually benefit from leadership that comes from the outside. So, here I am, Lord, send me. And I may not be a Catholic, but I am a grateful partaker of Catholic institutions, many of which are generously shared. The author of the reading didn't seem to be aware of Catholic hospitality, but I have had wonderful experiences of continuing education and spiritual renewal in Catholic seminaries and abbeys as close by as Cours and Montagno, and in places all over the nation. I also have a lot of admiration for those feisty American nuns, some of whom have been dear friends over the years, who got into so much hot water with the current Pope last year, and for the work that they do among the poor all over the world. There's a lot to admire about the Catholic Church, and my popedom, if I am so chosen, will be not a hostile takeover, but a willing labor of both a grateful guest and an admirer of some parts of Catholic culture. And I actually do have some real-life experience in helping religious institutions move into their futures in healthier and more productive ways. Unitarian Universalist institutions, of course, but still, 2 churches, a camp, an organization of senior clergy, and I got to tell you, if you think nuns are feisty, oh my gosh, you have no idea. Well, anyway, that's a different story. I think we all know that the Catholic Church, along with most other religious institutions in the developed Western world, is in big trouble. The Pew Research folks say that here in America, for every new person who's joined a Catholic church, 4 have left since the 1960s. The great majority of those who have joined are new immigrants from predominantly Catholic nations to the south of us, and it seems likely that the children of these immigrants will begin to drift away from the church as they become Americanized. All over the nation, the Catholic Church is selling buildings and closing parishes. There are not enough religious professionals to lead the congregations that remain. In 2010, the National Catholic Register, that's the U.S. Catholic magazine, wrote that the Church's difficulty retaining members amounted to, I quote, one of the largest institutional crises in centuries, possibly in church history. In Europe, the Catholic picture is even more dire, especially in nations like Ireland and Spain, which have a history of devotion. In 1991, for instance, 84% of the Irish population attended Mass at least once a week. Today, the weekly attendance figure is less than 50%. That's a big change in only 20 years. In Spain, 81% of the population identifies as Catholic, but 2/3 of them say they seldom or never go to church. They also have a shortage of clergy in Europe. In 2009, a grand total of 16 new priests were ordained in all of England. Now let me just stop and say to you that if I go off and become Pope, you will still have to deal with your own version of these issues. American Catholicism is not the only church that is holding on to its market share by its fingernails. So are the American Unitarian Universalists, declining by a few percentage points for the last few years after growing by that same few percentage points for a few years previous, all during a population boom. The kind of vigorous growth that this church here in Albuquerque, Edgewood, Socorro, and Carlsbad, now the 11th largest among the 1,000 UU congregations in America, has posted is actually pretty rare in Unitarian Universalism or even in the Protestant world. The Methodists have taken a 30% hit in membership in 30 years. The Presbyterians have shrunk by 20% since the year 2000. The Southern Baptists have dropped in their numbers too, as have evangelicals as a whole. The only religious groups to post growth unrelated to immigration are those with high birth rates, like the Mormons and Orthodox Jews, and by the way, that does not include Catholics, whose birth rate is about average in America. This membership bleed out is the result mostly of an ever larger group of adults who tell researchers that they have no religion. Sometimes they're called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, a body which has nearly doubled in every generation since World War II. 36% of current 20-somethings say they have no religion, and there are fewer and fewer people in generations above them which had nearly universal participation. Massive church decline is inevitable in this multi-generational slide, and it's going to get a lot worse. Lots of those in the younger generations who claim no religion, by the way, do claim to be spiritual people who have an interest in that side of life. They call themselves the spiritual but not religious. And so why are they not Catholics or Baptists like their parents? Well, they give researchers several reasons pretty uniformly. Firstly, they've come to believe that homosexuality is just another human variation, not a grave sin, and they have embraced the use of birth control and premarital sex, and in lesser but still majority numbers, in the necessity of resorting to abortion. Their moral clarity on these matters has alienated them from traditional doctrine and the churches which teach it. Secondly, they just don't believe in a God, that any God worth the name God would condemn most of the world to hell just because they're not Orthodox Christians. And thirdly, they look at the inability of the Catholic Church to deal with its crisis of pedophile priests with horror and tar all religious bodies with the feather of being more interested in institutional safety than in the original mission of caring for souls. Now, I have to admit, when I hear stories like this on the radio, there's a whole thing on National Public Radio just last month about this. I want to yell, over here, 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 us. We don't believe any of that. We could help. There are a number of reasons that, by and large, the nuns don't flock to us. Reasons that here in Albuquerque we've tried to understand and address, which is why we have a pretty balanced age demographic and have grown by 100% in 3 decades. So if I became Pope, I would expect that you would continue to thrive. But I digress. It's true that Catholicism is booming in Africa, growing in the Orient, and holding its own in Central and South America. That's making for an ever more multicultural global church, and that's a challenge for a leadership body which only 8 years ago managed for the first time to elect a non-Italian but still very European Pope. A majority of American Catholics would like to see an African or Hispanic Pope, but it doesn't seem likely to happen. Although only 1/4 of all Catholics reside in Europe, more than half of the cardinals are Europeans. Well, that's not very democratic. Not that the Church has ever claimed to be democratic. To this American, though, it seems a little unseemly, and if I were Pope, I would work to make the leadership of the Church more representative of the people of the Church. But the single most important thing that the next Pope must do, both as a matter of morality and as a matter of stemming the tide of those leaving the Church, is to deal with the sex abuse scandal, which is another thing that's driving the younger generations away, and not only from the Catholic Church, but from religion in general. They get it that while any institution can find itself with a wrongdoer in its midst, and bureaucrats whose first impulse in a crisis is to protect the institution rather than to do what's right, misconduct on this scale and over this amount of time just can't be chalked up to a few bad apples or misguided managers. This is not just a few bad apples, it's thousands of bad apples, and not just in sexually permissive America, but in Ireland, where an opposite ethos prevails. More tellingly, this is not a matter of an institution which finds itself with a problem and deals with it clumsily until it learns better. It's a matter of an institution which finds itself with a problem, and nearly every action taken at every level over 2 generations makes the problem worse, and in spite of embarrassing, expensive consequences, keeps on making those same mistakes. And that points not to human foible, but to a deeply flawed institution. If I were the Pope, I would not only dismiss every priest with credible accusations against him, I'd discipline every superior who allowed such priests continued responsibility for children. And I would go further. Because although nobody ever really will know how this crisis got started, I would take my best guess, which is a best guess taken by many people, and make one big change. I would end the requirement of celibacy for priests who wanted to marry, joining the religions of the rest of the world, none of which require celibacy of all of its religious leaders. This requirement has only been a part of Roman Catholicism for half its life. So we're not talking about heresy here, just custom. By its fruits you shall know it, from the book of Matthew. That reminds us that in the end, the best way to judge a prophet, a prophecy, a custom, or a policy is to ask about its results. The results of priestly celibacy have been just horrifying. And if I were the Pope, I'd take Jesus' advice on this matter. That one was a bad idea. Opening up the priesthood, at least the parish priesthood, to married men would assist in solving the priest shortage problem, would bring a cadre of men with presumably healthier relationships with women and children into the priesthood who would change the culture of that institution. And men with children are men with daughters. And men with daughters are often nudged towards feminism in our world and are in favor of opportunity and security for the children they love. A more balanced set of leaders in the church will have a more balanced view of human sexuality, as well as masculinity and femininity in a human life. And if I'm elected Pope, I will bring, after all, not only my husband with me, but a life of balancing marriage, child-rearing, and ministry. Not always perfectly, of course, but I've done it. If the problem was just that the church had to keep dealing with errant priests, then we could assume that the only problem was with celibacy. But the response to this crisis has been criminal and complicit, blindly, stupidly, expensively, all the way to the top. It's hard for an outsider like this papal candidate to imagine how it could have been worse. Immoral actions taken to protect the institution were so obviously not protective that you just have to ask, what in the Sam Hill is going on around here? And when someone does, they will conclude that there's a set of problems that revolve not around the sin of lust, but around the sin of pride and will to power. And if I'm the Pope, you'll hear a lot about that. Apologies are all well and good. But for the Catholic Church to retain its street cred in America and Europe, there's got to be a big public change, or it will continue to decline. There are those who broke no change, of course. There always are. The new Pope will face a basic choice I found starkly stated in an article in a Catholic publication. I quote, "At what point ought the Church to attempt to accommodate for the increasing pluralistic and scientific age? And when should the Church make the world accommodate to itself?" Isn't that a gem? Note the prominent sin of pride at play. Laying aside as a given that the Catholic Church can no longer, if it ever could, make the world accommodate to itself, and had better get used to the fact, the question still remains, is it our God-given mission to do things the way we always have done them, even though this is making us less able to serve people? Or should we open ourselves to the possibility of meeting a new generation's needs in new ways whenever we can do so with integrity to our core values? There are Catholic voices on both sides of that argument. And by the way, there are UU voices on both sides of that same argument, our version of the same argument. I feel both sides in my heart sometimes, and I bet you do too. However, if I'm elected Pope of the Catholic Church, that word Catholic means universal, you remember, I will take that as my clue and come firmly down on the side of adaptation for greater service whenever I possibly can. And among other things, I would look to past practices for my clues. The church had a married clergy for half of its life. The church was okay with engaged couples having sex for even longer and turned a blind eye on the necessity of abortion for even longer than that. Jesus said not one word about homosexuality, and there were independent female religious leaders all throughout the Bible and in the early church. These matters which are causing such pain right now are not eternally unchangeable, and nothing is undiscussable. Elect me, and I will call for Vatican III. And there's a couple of other things. For you Americans dealing with your gun crisis, I say this. From the book of Deuteronomy, thus saith the Lord, when you build a new house, you must build a low wall around your roof. Otherwise, someone might fall from it, and you will be responsible for his death. People are morally responsible for the safe use of the things they have, even if they have them by right. I'm no expert on your constitutional problem, although I hear that your Second Amendment was adopted mostly to mollify the slave states that used militias to hunt down runaway slaves. But I am an expert on social morality, and among the things that I would urge my leaders in your nation to preach and teach and work for are laws that require responsible gun ownership, not only background checks and insurance, but enforcing child endangerment laws. You can be arrested for leaving a toddler in a car seat while you pay for your gas in America, but not for leaving a loaded gun around for that toddler to play with. It's nuts. Catholics are not the only people who try to live decent lives while embedded in a sick system which is blind to the harm that it does. So do Americans. And as to my platform on the economy, immigration, and other issues facing Americans, I would not differ so much from my predecessors, who, following our teacher Jesus, have taught that a society has a responsibility to its weakest members. He said, after all, Jesus did at the beginning of his ministry, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach the good news to the poor, to proclaim the release for captives and the recovery of sight for the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, and proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." If I were Pope, I would take those as my watchwords. And as for whether a woman could ever become Pope, well, this has been an exercise in imaginative recreation of reality, hasn't it? I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have, but I do want you to know that if elected, I already have my shoes.